This is Sophie Heller, and this is an ACT punctuation and pronouns question. So we see here that we have underlined this and intuition, semicolon, people, whom. So we're going to want to look at two things. We're going to want to look at the correct punctuation, so between this intuition and people, in this case a colon, but it changes. And we're going to want to see whether we want people whom, as we have in our first choice, or people who, as we have in choices 2 and 4. So let's look at our answer choices. So our first choice tells us, we might conclude that research of a complex nature requires such traits as mathematical imagination and intuition. Okay, so this is one block about telling us what we might think that research requires. But here's a contrast. People who can perform these college-level functions in other areas should be able to handle math as well. So we have this long sentence, and we want to connect this. While some people might think, however, it's a different thing. So we want to bring in this contrast. So we want to see first off if our punctuation makes sense. So in here it's a little hard to see, but we had a colon, and a colon is used. So if you have a sentence, you can have a colon, and then you can introduce another sentence. You can introduce a list. So with here, the problem we have here, so we see here that with a colon, we want to have a sentence. We want to have a fully formed thought. We have this while, and this while isn't going to lead to a complete sentence. So it's telling us, while we might conclude that research requires these things, that's not a full sentence, that's a fragment. So since we have a fragment on this side, we won't be able to use a colon. That just won't fulfill the rules of when we can use a colon. So choice 1 is going to be wrong on a purely punctuational standpoint. Let's look at choice 2 because it also has punctuation. We have a comma. So we have a comma between such traits as mathematical imagination, comma, and intuition. So since we're listing these two traits, so this mathematical imagination is a trait, and so is intuition. It's awkward to put a comma between them to break them up. We just wouldn't need this comma. So because this comma is here, this is going to be wrong. So our next two don't have commas between imagination and intuition. That's good. And instead of a colon, they have a comma here, which is great because this while part is a dependent clause. So we need to set it apart by a comma. So the difference here is that we have people whom, so it's an object, and people who, it's a subject. So let's look at the sentence. So it tells us people whom can perform college-level functions. So it's the people is the subject. And what are the people doing? They're performing college-level functions. So here's our verb phrase. So since we want to connect a subject to a verb phrase, we want to have a connector here that allows people to remain our subject, connecting to this verb phrase. So this whom is bad because whom is functioning as an object. So when you have a different, so if you had subject 2 here, like people whom I see performing college level functions. But since we want the subject and the verb, so it's the same subject, there's no subject 2. We don't want to use whom. We want to use who to connect this people to the action that they're performing. So whom isn't going to be right. Who is perfect.